Happy New Year. The Foreign Affairs Committee is coming to the end of its inquiry on disinformation. And we have had several evidence sessions, and we've met with experts here and overseas. We've also had a lot of written evidence, and we'd like to thank people who've helped us with this inquiry and who've spent time giving us their evidence. Today we're hearing from the responsible minister, Stephen Doughty. Minister, could you introduce who you've got with you?
I have Jonny Hall here, who is our Directorate in our hybrid Directorate.
Lovely. Can I begin by asking you a general question? What assessment have you made of the scale of the threat that we face in Europe from disinformation? And probably most importantly, how much threat do we face in the UK?
Well, firstly, Chair, Happy New Year, Bloyd and Newydd, and to you and the committee members. And genuinely, I wanted to thank you and the committee for undertaking this important inquiry. I think it's absolutely crucial. I think it's absolutely timely, and I genuinely welcome the scrutiny and the ability to share some of the work that we've been doing.
I think the more that we've been finding out, the more we realise how important it is and how timely it is.
Absolutely, and I've been visiting and engaging in many of the same locations that you and the committee members have visited as well. I think the first thing to say is that disinformation's nothing new. The Russians coined the phrase over a century ago, and we can look at many, many different examples in history, including, of course, extraordinary examples such as the KGB promotion of lies around the origins of AIDS, and many, many other examples. And I think it's important to recognise that, and this has been going on for a long time, but I think we do see a completely different scale and nature of the threat. New technologies obviously made it easier to spread harmful activity widely, and what we now face is coordinated, well-funded information operations by hostile states that are determined to weaken and divide our democracies and societies, and it's part of a growing wave of wider hybrid threats we're seeing across Europe and beyond, including targeting the UK. And I want to be really clear, Chair, this is information warfare. And the playbook spans fake news sites, deepfake videos, armies of bots flooding social media with lies. You'll have seen and heard of many of the different examples. And just to give the committee an idea of the scale of the threat that we face, particularly from Russia, this year, Russia alone plans to spend 30 million euros weekly on state propaganda. Its own budget proposals admit this. It's a total of 1.5 billion euros. Outlets like Rybar already push content in 28 languages, reaching millions. And of course, we know from very, very high-profile examples, such as during the Skripal poisonings, that we were flooded with different conflicting, disturbing and fake narratives about the origins of that attack, which of course we know were of course Russia. And we of course see overt state propaganda, but we also see covert operations outsourced to others to hide Russia's intent. And of course we see it most clearly around attempts to fracture unity and support for Ukraine. And that work is happening everywhere. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa. And the Security Minister, my colleague in the Home Office, Minister Jarvis, has spoken about this as well. But we're also resisting that, and we can and we will identify and resist shoddy attempts to interfere in our democracies. We will build resilience. And your visits, as I said, to many of the countries, whether it's Moldova, Romania, the Western Balkans, we are working closely with a range of allies and partners, including in the EU. We're responding. And I wanted to highlight three particular areas that we're working on. Firstly, we're acting against organisations and individuals behind Russia's information warfare through sanctions and exposures. And since autumn of 2024, we've sanctioned 38 Russia-linked organisations, and we've hit agencies like the Doppelganger Network, Rybar, Pravfond. These are all fronts for Kremlin lies and criminality. And they demonstrate, and I think this is really important to understand, a coordinated attempt to destabilise countries and regions that matter to our own security and stability. But we're really clear, we know what you're doing. If you are running propaganda mills, attacking our systems, freezing assets, blocking services, we will freeze assets, we will block services, we will shut you out. We obviously can't police or deal with every single individual piece of content, but we can take out the nodes, the networks, those that are amplifying, that are doing the biggest amount of damage, whether that's here in the UK or elsewhere. Secondly, we're providing direct support to those on the front line of Russian attempts, and whether that's in Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, that's proved very effective. And we are continuing, thirdly, to work with others, France, Germany, the EU and others. We're sharing lessons, we're coordinating responses, we're maximising the impact on adversaries, and we're working closely, of course, here in the UK, you asked, Chair, with our fellow ministers in other departments, particularly in the Home Office, MOD, Cabinet Office, DCIT, DCMS. This is a cross-government effort. Obviously, I will speak to a lot of the international aspects today in your questions, but I want to be clear, this is a cross-HMG effort, and we're taking the insight that we see about what is happening elsewhere and using that to build our resilience here, which, of course, is the responsibility of domestic departments. But can I say one last thing, Chair? I just want to be really clear. Despite our very strong efforts, internationally, working with partners, with allies and others to disrupt Russian information warfare, I'm sorry and shocked to say that there are, of course, those in our own politics who shamefully undermine that work and our national security, and whether that is, you know, as willing fools, whether it's as paid agents, as we saw with the former leader of Reform in Wales, taking Russian bribes to share narratives, or quite frankly, those who do it for free in this place and elsewhere, that fundamentally undermines all of that incredible work that teams across government that we're doing with our allies, and I think we just need to be clear about that and call it out for what it is.
Thank you.
I think the impression that we got, I hope I'm speaking on behalf of the committee, is we were really shocked to see the extent to which there is organised disinformation in countries across the world. And I think that our concern is, to what extent is it happening in the UK, and are we sufficiently alert to it? Can I just give you an example that was just in the Evening Standard? And as a London MP, other members of the committee will laugh at this because they know that I keep wanging on about this, is the way in which London is maligned, and maligned as a centre of violent crime. And there's a report saying that there's been an analysis of Reddit by Mark Hill, who showed that he's a lecturer in King's College, that there's been a year-on-year increase in the number of posts pushing the narrative that London is dangerous and a lawless city, despite the fact there's been a reduction in violent crime in London. And the number of posts contributing to that narrative have gone up from 874 in 2008 to 258,000 in 2024. And when you look at it, you can see that the images are AI generated, and there is a huge amount of suspicion as to what is going on. This does seem to be some form of organised undermining of our capital city. And given that challenge, what I think we would like to know, given what we've learned as to happening in other countries, can we be confident that this is being countered in the UK?
Well, I think we can be, and I think the Security Minister made that clear in his remarks at the National Security Strategy Joint Committee last year, where, for example, he was talking about the last general election, where he was clear that there were attempts at interference activity, and that's very clearly documented. But equally, and I quote exactly what he said, we judged not to have reached the thresholds to impact or influence the outcome of the elections. And I think that is a crucial point. So I want to share your concern about the scale here, and the fact that this is an ever-evolving threat, and that we must remain absolutely laser-like focused on this across government, and there's a range of measures being undertaken, including a review by Sir Philip Rycroft and others at the moment, and colleagues in the Home Office, Cabinet Office working on these issues. We work through a body called the Defending Democracy Task Force with ministers, which I sit on, the Joint Election Security and Preparedness Unit, and of course insight from what we see happening elsewhere in the world, and what we know that networks are doing, and the sorts of networks that we're attempting to disrupt and degrade is part of that, in understanding our own efforts against this action. But what I would say is I think we're doing a good job in defending, and I think, of course, the British people are part of this too, and I think people are incredibly savvy now at spotting fakes, at spotting issues. But these threats are evolving, they're expanding. The figures you cite don't surprise me at all. We all see it, all as individual members of Parliament, on our own social media accounts. And that's where I come back to the first point I was making. This is information warfare. This is not just individual tweets or individual posts on TikTok. This is coordinated, systematic efforts by adversaries to undermine our democracy and that of allies and partners, particularly around key topics like support for Ukraine.
I go to Uma, and then I'm going to go to Fleur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. We heard extensively that warfare, cognitive warfare, hybrid warfare. It was actually quite terrifying. When we visited Romania late last year, the committee, they held their presidential elections last year. In 2024, those were suspended due to the sheer scale of disinformation from Russian intervention. One of the things that we discussed was the information campaign targeting the Romanian diaspora abroad, especially in Britain, so related to the post the Chair was talking about. There's a lot in London. There were actually fake conscription letters being sent out to Romanians in London, and the Romanian authorities had to actually issue a clarification that this wasn't true. I take your point that people are getting savvier. You receiving an official looking letter in Romanian with the seal of the ministry saying that you are being conscripted to fight in the war against Ukraine, that is pretty terrifying. What are we doing in Britain to make sure that foreign interference isn't continuing to happen like this?
So, I mean, the example that you cite is deeply disturbing, and indeed I'm well aware of the attempts to influence the diaspora here, but not just, of course, the Romanian diaspora, but other groups too. And I think we are incredibly alert to that. And certainly my colleagues in other departments that I mentioned are incredibly alert to that. And I discussed these issues when I was in Bucharest myself with the Romanian authorities, and we've seen that, of course, with the other diaspora groups from other countries that you mentioned. As I said, we're working very closely through that Defending Democracy Task Force. We're working very closely with the Home Office, with DCIT, with DCMS and others. I'm confident that we have a very good sense of what is going on and the types of tactics that are being used. Ultimately, as I said, there's a number of reviews ongoing at the moment in light of recent events. And I think what you rightly point out is, although, as I said, people are savvy now that this disinformation is out there, new techniques and new tactics are being used all the time. And
I think that although people are savvy to the fact that there is disinformation out there, they don't necessarily, if they're influenced by it, they don't realise they've been influenced by it. That's by definition is what the problem is. So you may think in principle, I know there are bots. But if you point out, well, this is a bot, people go, and I've started doing it on my own social media. I've said, New Year's resolution, let's identify some bots. So I will retweet a bot and say, this is a bot because of this, this and this. And the amount of arguing I get, some of which, of course, is from bots, this is the difficulty. Sorry,
No. I mean, go back to that example I gave of the narratives that were put out around the Skripal poisoning. I mean, I remember those being reflected back to me in my own constituency, sort of, unwittingly by individuals, and of course even around this place. And this has been going on for some time. But I am equally as confident that we have very strong coordination in place and an understanding of what's happening, and that's why the work that we do as the FCDO is so crucial in understanding what is happening in other locations and what might be the new fronts, what might be the new tactics, what might be the new angles that Russia in particular is using.
Can I ask, how confident or comfortable are we that we can actually explain to the British public that this is happening? Is the government willing to declassify any of it? Are we able to make public some of this information? Because if you go on Reddit, if you Google, if you look on Twitter, this stuff's out there. But are the government considering a public information campaign to explain to people this is happening, be aware? Because I appreciate we've got a Defending Democracy Task Force. The department is doing great work there. But if we're not telling people we're doing it, how are people aware this is even happening?
I'll come to Jonny in a moment to give you some. I mean, obviously, I appreciate there are there are complexities around attribution and about what we can say about certain things and whether that's the right thing to do at different points. But we have taken some very, very public action against some of the agencies that I mentioned, Social Design Agency, Doppelganger, others. We've used our sanctions very, very clearly. I managed, give you an example. In December, obviously the Foreign Secretary gave her speech on this issue in the Locarno speech, and we imposed 7 more sanctions targeting entities and associated individuals, RIBAR, Centre for Geopolitical Expertise, which of course is actually a Moscow-linked think tank linked to the Russian intelligence services, which has been funding and directing a malign influence network known as Storm 1516. We also sanctioned Pravfond, which is a front for the GRU. So we have taken a number of high-profile examples, but I couldn't be clearer in what I said at the start of this session. That's why I think this committee's inquiry is so important. This is information warfare. This is coordinated. This is extraordinarily well funded. And I think the scale of that funding, just from Russia alone, I hope that members of the public watching this committee will see the scale of this.
What you're saying is right. The committee, it was pretty terrifying listening to what we heard. Given the fact that this is warfare, it's a hybrid and cognitive warfare, have we considered establishing a national counter-disinformation centre where all of this work can be dealt with by one unit rather than different departments as we're seeing now, so that they've got dedicated responsibility for tackling this?
So we do work very closely together with the departments. I'll turn to Jonny. You can say a little bit more about some of that coordination.
Thank you. Can I just expand a little bit on the Minister's last answer and then bridge into this one? Because I think it is really important, as the Minister said. And it's one of the central rationales, actually, for the scaling up of public activity that we have taken over the last year, 18 months, in response to this threat. So when we attribute, when we sanction, as the Minister says, that has intended disruptive and deterrent effect on those responsible and state actors behind these campaigns, but actually it also very much is intended to contribute to that public awareness and that public understanding of the reality of what is happening, precisely in the way that you mentioned in terms of public communication. So by exposing and being able to articulate the reality of what, say, Russia in this instance is doing, the tactics, techniques, procedures, what it is that people should be alive to, absolutely we feel has that public resilience benefit to help drive that conversation. More broadly, in terms of the cross-government architecture, as the Minister says, we are currently working and will continue to improve how various aspects of capability work across departments. We're not currently looking at a single entity to deal with this, given the different nature of the challenge between domestic security and then actually the range of actions we'd look to take upstream and internationally to raise the costs against specific actors for this. But we are absolutely continuing to look at how we strengthen the frameworks, the governance, the join-up between the various departments and the coherence of our efforts.
Thank you. So following on from there, and I've also read your response to our inquiry on that and about the cross-HMEG structures, which is a whole section on that. Very good to see, because there's a lot of comments from others who are looking at the government's response on disinformation and saying that it's not joined up enough. So I've got a couple of questions about relating to, we heard from the Permanent Secretary there's a lot of cuts going on in the FCDO. There's a lot of staff being reduced, especially in London in the first wave, and then in the missions overseas in the next wave. How many staff are working on this issue, and what would that be in relation to how many were working on it this year, and how many do you think will be working on it kind of by next summer after the cuts have gone through, to give an idea about sort of backing up what you're saying about responding appropriately to the increasing scale of the threat?
So totally understand where you're coming from, Ms. Anderson, but I'm not going to get into specific numbers on staffing or funding for the very reason that gives insight to our adversaries. But what I can absolutely assure you of is that this is one of the highest priorities for the Foreign Secretary and myself in terms of resourcing and support. There has been a substantial uptick in activity and capability on this, and in terms of that kind of cross-government piece, I understand where some of that critique has come from. I regularly, even at a ministerial level, am discussing these issues with my counterparts, particularly in the Home Office, the MOD, Cabinet Office, and elsewhere, and was doing so just in recent weeks, and will be doing so again in the next week. So this is a significant ministerial priority, is a significant priority for resourcing, and I think if you look at it within the context of the overall investment that this government's making in defence and security, and the spending targets that the Defence Secretary, the Prime Minister have set as well, the SDR and the NSS, of course that covers a whole range of capabilities and resourcing beyond conventional military and security capability, and this is part of that.
I absolutely understand that you can't say these people are in post here and what are they doing, but can you give any more reassurance, or is there other way of writing to me afterwards maybe about the numbers, because we don't want to find out in a year's time that actually the numbers have gone down in different units that you're talking about and we didn't realise that was happening. We've been asking questions about staffing, and I absolutely understand you can't say for security reasons where they are, but can there be assurance about the numbers, that because there are big changes going on in the next few months?
Can I put it another way? If you find it difficult to answer that question, maybe it's easier to answer it this way, which is that given that it is a ministerial priority, can you assure us that there will be no reduction in staff dealing with these matters?
So I think the reassurance I would give, or one aspect of the reassurance, through the director restructure process that I know the Permanent Secretary talked to you about, so at the director level, we have created a new director position that is the Directorate that I am now charged with building, which is for hybrid threats specifically, and that is an evolution of our work. But even against the backdrop that you talked about and that the Permanent Secretary talked through, we have actually sharpened the remit of my responsibility in this role, specifically around this set of threats that we face, and therefore the way in which we ensure that we have the capability, the tools, the expertise to deal with the ministerial priority chair that you mentioned.
So does that mean there's no reduction in staff on this?
I think, as the Permanent Secretary said, we're now working through all of the staffing and headcount across the whole organisation, but I hope it is of some reassurance that in terms of that director accountability piece...
Not much. It's not much.
I'm happy to write further to hopefully give you some more reassurances in writing, but this is a significant priority for the Foreign Secretary, myself, and for ministers across government, and
we hear that, but it's always kind of good to have it backed up with numbers. And if we can't have the numbers, then at least something that gives us some more general reassurance.
So one more on just the funding.
Go on then. Can I just say we're not pushed for time in the way that we thought we might be. Just say that.
Okay. Just back on the funding, therefore, you talked about this is warfare. The scale of this is enormous, and also there's a huge uplift of funding to the Ministry of Defence. Will some of the funding for this work across government, in the way that the units are shared across different departments, be able to come out of defence spending, given that it is a defence issue as well, to maybe compensate from some areas that might otherwise be reduced because of reduction in foreign FCDO spending?
I mean, defence spending does include work on information threats already, and this is a cross-government piece of work, and that's why I emphasise particularly the coordination between ourselves, the Home Office, and the Ministry of Defence and Cabinet Office on this. It's absolutely clear that 5% target that we've got on national security by 2035 includes the work to tackle information threats and information warfare.
Might there be some people who used to be paid for by the Foreign Office and who are now paid for by the Ministry of Defence?
I don't want to speak for the Ministry of Defence and in their budgeting, and they go through their own processes as well. And you're welcome to ask those questions to the Ministry of the Armed Forces. But what I'd say is there is a cross-government perspective on this, and there's very close working between Jonny and his colleagues in MOD, Home Office, and elsewhere, as there is at the ministerial level as well.
Can I just ask you about the principle surrounding the definition of disinformation? I mean, there are clear examples we can think of, like that MH17 was full of corpses or was shot down by a Ukrainian aircraft, which demonstrably is false information. But we discovered when we were looking, for instance, in Montenegro and in Moldova, the principal debate there is about whether or not they should join the European Union. And the question is, at what point is this a robust political argument with opposing views? And where do you draw the line and say, no, this is disinformation? And how can you ensure that we keep the right side of the line and that we aren't censoring, as some would suggest, freedom of speech?
I'm a strong believer in freedom of speech, as is the government, and I think it's one of the things that makes this country great. And I'm very proud that we have the robust political and media landscape that we do here. And I want to be really explicit. Just because somebody has tweeted something that's wrong or fake, or something that I disagree with personally, or that the government disagrees with, that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about coordinated, highly funded operations emanating from adversaries, and those can sometimes also be terrorist organisations as well, and that is what we are focused at tackling. We're not in the interest here, nor would we have the capability to censor or respond to an individual message on whether it's on TikTok or whether it's on Telegram. What we're looking at is widespread, and I think you do get to a very important point, of course. Sometimes what is happening here is the exacerbation of existing legitimate and entirely proper political debates, but skewing that into division, attempts to totally undermine democratic systems and otherwise. But actually, if you go back to that historic example of the conspiracy theories about the origins of AIDS, there were others who were, positing these conspiracy theories, were out there and was totally wrong. What Russia did, what Soviet Union did at the time, was, of course, to totally sort of weaponize and actively energize that in a way that would not have happened organically. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
And when we were in France, we were talking to Viginum, who said specifically that they didn't seek to counter-argument, but actually what they were focusing on was the propagation through bots and artificial means, the amplification.
That's absolutely right. Jonny can probably say a little bit more on this.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. We work very closely with our French colleagues in Viginum, and like them, in many ways, this is why you probably heard a lot of use of the slightly clunky expression FIMI, or foreign information manipulation interference, precisely because of this definitional challenge. Like Viginum, what we are very much focused on is actually the who as much as the what. So who is behind this? What are the networks being used to propagate those narratives? And how do we build the tools to make it harder for those responsible to operate and mislead, deceive, and so deceit at the scale that they are? So absolutely making sure that we are focused on that delicate balance.
Thank you. Uma, I think you've got a follow-up, and then I'm going to go to Richard, who needs to get into the chamber.
Thank you, Chair. Following the annulled Romanian elections, the European Commission actually opened formal proceedings against TikTok for the scale of disinformation that was out there using the Digital Services Act. Given that we've got different sets of tools here for regulating risks around elections, are we working with European partners on this? And if we are, what are the barriers to cooperation? Minister, I know you said it's not about individual messages and things, but it is a concerted scale campaign, one on TikTok, one on Instagram, on Facebook. You only have to look at any of the comments some of us get. You can see it's happening. What are we doing? And would we consider taking action as the European Commission have?
Ultimately, actions the European Commission takes are for them to take under their European-wide legislation. We've got a series of legislative tools here. It's really a matter for our domestic ministers on how those are developed further in response to threats. But what I would say is that we are coordinating very closely with partners around the world, and in fact I've taken part directly in discussions with the European Union around hybrid threats. It was one of the things we launched actually as a result of the UK-EU summit in May, and the security and defence partnership with the EU. I've taken part in those conversations directly in Brussels. We're working closely with Kaja Kallas and her team, looking at these threats. The EU, of course, is pursuing its Democracy Shield programme. We're looking at that with interest. They look at what we're doing with great interest. And actually, one thing I would say is in the last year, we have substantially ramped up and actually shown real leadership actually with European partners and colleagues in responding to and sharing best practice. And it's the work that Jonny and many others have done with colleagues, because we're all seeing different aspects of this, but we all have different legislative environments, we all have different instances, but I wouldn't want to get focused in on any one particular platform or otherwise, because in some ways the platform here is not the issue. It's the origins, it's the networks, it's the nodes. They might be using anything from Discord through to Telegram through to TikTok through to Facebook. It's a very if you just try simply to go after each individual platform or each individual message, we're not going to deal with the scale of this. It's the origins, it's the networks behind.
If the European legislation is successful, then are you keeping a close eye on it so that we can perhaps coordinate in and use the same kind of legislation? Because we have legislation, but it's for the protection of kids. This is the European legislation is much broader than that.
Yeah, I mean, look, fundamentally, these are questions for ministerial colleagues in DCET and DCMS and elsewhere, but we are watching very closely what other countries are doing in response to these threats, and like they're watching us as well.
And that's why this is not coordinated. This is one of our complaints.
Well, I totally agree with you. There needs to be much more coordination, and that's what we've attempted to do, particularly in the last year. And I can absolutely assure you, whether it's at a ministerial or an official level, there has been a step change really in the level of engagement that we have with both individual partner countries, but also Europe-wide.
How is the FCDO combating Russian hostile state activity?
In the
information space.
In the information space, in a range of ways. I would point to particularly some of the designations that we've undertaken, some of the exposures that we've done. Those have been substantial. They've been impactful. Quite frankly, they also show up the scale of this, but also quite frankly if they think they're getting away with this, they should think very, very differently, because we know what they're doing, we know how they're doing it, and we will not stand idly by while they do it. And we've shown that repeatedly across the last year. And I think also one thing I would emphasise, going back to my comments at the start, is that we're seeing how they're doing this in locations around the world, and exposing that too. And it's not just in Europe, of course, it's what they're doing in Africa, in the global south, elsewhere, in propagating these narratives on an industrial scale. And we work very closely with other partners to sort of identify this and to make sure that their countries and populations can see what is happening generally, and that they can build their own resilience to these kind of threats.
And when we are exposing it, when we are drawing attention to it and illustrating to the world what is going on, how do we avoid inadvertently promoting Russian disinformation?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I think it's a question that we all have to consider. The tendency, to sort of show outrage about something by resharing it and commenting on it. I've certainly learnt over the last years to try and avoid doing that, and we do all have to think very, very carefully about not accidentally amplifying narratives in other ways. We take that into significant consideration when we're looking at exposures or otherwise. Jonny, want to say a little bit about that?
Thank you, Minister. I think it's absolutely a challenge, and as the Minister says, it is one of the many careful considerations that go into any choice we make to expose, attribute, sanction and take action in the public domain. It is also, it comes back, I think, in many ways to this question of networks as opposed to narratives, and the behaviour and those responsible, which is when we make a choice to attribute and expose, we are making a choice to really try and pull back the curtain on the various ways and means that the whole ecosystem and architecture operates, as opposed to being drawn into a narrative rebuttal that absolutely risks drawing attention to the specific narrative itself.
When you're trying to educate people, when you're trying to sort of illustrate to the public some of these techniques, these the TTPs, how do you actually do that without giving examples? Because really people are most interested in specific cases and being switched on to the fact that a particular item is information manipulation?
I'll let Jonny give a little bit more of the detail, but I'm going to give you two examples from last year. So in May last year, we sanctioned 14 members of the Social Design Agency, which was one of the most notorious examples of Kremlin-funded information operations, designed particularly targeting, unity and resolve over the war in Ukraine and so on. And just to give an example of the sorts of things we're doing in other parts of the world, in July, alongside NATO allies and the EU, we exposed and sanctioned 4 entities and 21 operatives of the Russian state, which included a body called the African Initiative, which was a social media content mill established and funded by Russia and employing Russian intelligence operatives that conducts information operations in West Africa. So, we're taking some very, very deliberate and public actions to not only expose that they're doing this, but also some of the means by which they're doing it and the entities that they're doing that through. If John wants to add.
And building on what the Minister said, if we look at other examples, because to deal with this challenge, when we attributed and exposed the Social Design Agency, the organisation behind the Doppelganger network, and attributed that to the Russian state, one of the things that we were very careful to do was actually spell out some of the weaknesses in that network's approach, the limited traction, the limited engagement, the ineffectiveness of various parts of the content, precisely for this reason, to spell out the tactics, techniques, procedures, raise awareness, while also being very clear that actually there is not a kind of uniformly effective kind of mind and hand behind some of this. We can see it. We do want to raise awareness of it, but we don't want to actually overstate the impact that it's able to have to walk that tightrope.
Can I just raise something that we decided to deprioritise as a question? Because given the answer the Minister's given, I think it's kind of an important one to ask, which is about Africa and about is the FCDO going to expand UK support for independent media and fact-checking initiatives in Africa?
We are engaged in supporting a range of independent media and fact-checking, as you know. Fundamentally, it's probably better if I get Minister Chapman to write to Chair on that issue, because she's going through the ODA allocations process and different civil society and other initiatives that we're involved in. I don't want to sort of, given the changes that are going on in budgets there, but what I will say is that we are acutely aware of the importance of free independent media, strong civil society organisations and so on as part of the kind of collective response to this kind of activity by Russia and others.
Minister, you've mentioned Ukraine as being a place where the information war is perhaps at its height, both in terms of seeking to undermine morale within Ukraine and undermine the president, but also globally in trying to detach countries from support. It features specifically as an article within the 100-year partnership we've signed that we will be supporting Ukraine. Can you give us some more detail about how we are supporting Ukraine in countering that kind of disinformation?
It is, as you say, a crucial part of the 100-year partnership, and I think actually I would also say, and I said this I think in a previous session, that we can't look at this just as a one-way street. This is also about us learning directly from Ukraine and indeed, Baltic partners, other, Romanian partners, Moldovan partners, and so on, about the techniques and tactics that are being used, and also what are the most effective ways to build resilience against them. But I'll let Jonny say a little bit more about some of the specific work. But you'll appreciate we can't go into granular detail on a lot of these things because, for obvious reasons, we don't want to expose that.
I would only add, we work with the Ukrainians across, in essence, all of the strands that we see as necessary to combat the type of information warfare that they are facing in an extremely acute way, but actually we are seeing across the entire continent. So we exchange and provide technical assistance, but also draw learning from the Ukrainians on strategic communication. We also provide assistance and exchange around our own techniques around open source intelligence and actually the identification and illumination of the threat, and work together very closely on that, as well as actually how we engage with global audiences about the nature of what is really happening. So it's a multifaceted relationship across the piece in terms of the information domain, and as the Minister has said, through the partnership, what we really hope to do is actually deepen that and continue to draw on the incredible work the Ukrainians have done to inform how we build our capabilities as much as the other way around.
Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the committee had the opportunity to visit a number of countries in the Eastern European neighbourhood over the last few months, places like Romania and Moldova and Bosnia, and you'll be aware there's massive Russian disinformation campaigns in those areas. Appreciate the sensitivities about sharing too much detail, but could you say a little more about the support we're providing to those types of countries in the Eastern European neighbourhood? And also, in our discussion with the Permanent Secretary, there was a suggestion in the accounts that the amount of money being spent on that work was reducing. Could you clarify whether that is the case?
I mean, on the second question, I'd go back to the points I made earlier on about the wider commitment that we have across government to spend 5% on national security by 2035, and of course that includes tackling information threats. But I'm very happy to write to follow up on that. Again, I don't want to appear sort of reluctant here, but I rather than going into specifics in relation to the work that we do with those countries, is just to reassure you that even at a ministerial level, there has been a lot of direct contact with the countries that you've visited. I've been to all bar Bosnia, but I'm in regular contact with the Bosnian and Herzegovina foreign minister and others on a range of topics. We discussed these issues in the margins of the Western Balkans summit as well, in recognition of our kind of collective work to defend security. Of course, we've got a number of NATO allies there with which our work is particularly and crucially important, and also forms part of wider NATO resilience in this area. Our work in Moldova to ensure the resilience of the democratic process there, I think was crucial and critical, and hugely welcomed by the authorities there, and they were under a sustained and pretty blatant attack to undermine their democratic processes directly from Russia in a range of ways. And of course, it wasn't just information operations; it was a whole range of other matters, as you will have heard on your visit there. So I'm quite confident in what we've been doing. And of course, we're always looking as well where are the next fronts, because they are trying out these techniques and tactics and I'm sure they will be doing it again in elections in a range of locations across the next year, and we're acutely alert to that and are working with different agencies in different ways to build resilience.
Great.
Can I tighten this up a bit, because I think that the reduction in funding for the work in Bosnia has been in the public realm. So I mean, I wonder if you could, even if you can't tell us now, could you? And if you can't, if I've got that wrong, if it's just something I've been told and it hasn't been in the public realm, then obviously you can't give me the figures. But if it is in the public realm, could you write and give us the figures? And if it's not in the public realm, could you at least give us percentages or trends? Because we felt when we were in Bosnia that the work that was being done was incredibly important, and were disappointed, to put it mildly, that that work might be being cut back at this vital moment.
So in terms of allocations across the board in ODA, as you'll know, under discussion by Mr. Chapman, and I'm very happy to write to you with further detail on that. I think there might be a misinterpretation of overall kind of cuts versus cuts in particular programming here, and I want to get you the exact detail on that and not give the wrong answer today.
Yeah, no, thank you. Sorry, I cut across you.
That's fine.
That's okay. Thank you for clarification. Very pleased to hear the sanctions that you've FCDO has placed on a number of these organisations, Social Design Agency and others. As they continue to pop up and different techniques are being used by the Russians, do you think economic sanctions, the sanctions you're placing on these organisations, are sufficient, or is there further steps the FCDO needs to take against these hybrid actors?
The sanctions do work, and we know that, and they work as well in terms of just the sheer exposure of the organisations their tactics and techniques, the fact that they're involved in issues which might cause them to be sanctioned in the first place, and we're very clear about that, and that's why we continue to use that as one of the key tools, and we'll continue to do so. As you know, I don't comment on future designations, but we're always looking at different opportunities to do that. We do it also through coordination through the G7 as well, the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, and we did that particularly on the Social Design Agency in January of last year, and that obviously then illustrates the types of activities that they're engaged in.
We move on. I think that Afra, you're going to ask some questions.
Yes. Hi, thank you. It was reported in December that the FCDO had been the victim of a cyber attack by the Chinese state-linked Storm 1849 group. I just wondered if you could confirm the nature and scale of this breach and whether you've confirmed who was responsible.
I'm not going to get into that particular. I guess you'd be aware of the reporting, but obviously we investigate any sort of potential threats against the FCD or any other part of government very, very, very seriously, and take appropriate measures to respond and build resilience against future attempts.
So we haven't confirmed whether it did or didn't occur? Perhaps Mr. Hall can elaborate?
I don't really want to add anything further on that at this stage, for obvious reasons.
I just wanted to ask, given that last time there was a confirmed cyber attack by Storm 1849 on MPs and the Electoral Commission, which occurred, I think, between 2021 and 2022, it took 3 years for the perpetrators to be identified. Are we expecting to wait this long for this to be confirmed either way?
I think you would agree with me that it's very, very important that we take any form of attribution or response to any allegations very, very carefully and very, very seriously. We do attribution on a case-by-case basis. It's not helpful to speculate about potential actors. We take the security of our systems and our data very, very seriously. And whenever we choose to attribute, it's on the basis of very, very thorough investigation, and that is in the interests of UK national security.
Okay, I take what you're saying there. So, but given that there are clear security threats posed by China, and we've heard from the Executive Director of the China Strategic Risks Institute, alongside that the Joint Committee on Human Rights and the Intelligence and Security Committee, to name just a few, have all asked why China, unlike Russia and Iran, have not been placed on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence and Registration Scheme. Could you perhaps explain what threshold you feel China hasn't met, which Russia and Iran have?
What I'd say is that, as we've said before and other colleagues have said before on this issue, countries are considered separately and decisions made on the evidence. Of course, the political influence tier of FIRS, which came into force at the same time as the enhanced tier, of course, includes all states. You referenced different alleged cyber incidents, but I give you a couple of examples where there's been very, very clear action taken. On the 9th of December last year, the Foreign Secretary announced sanctions on 2 China-based tech companies, iSoon and Integrity Tech, for reckless and indiscriminate cyber attacks against the UK and its allies. In August, the NCSC published technical advisory linking 3 China-based companies known as Salt Typhoon with targeting of telecommunications. In April, the NCSC did a similar technical advisory exposing 2 spyware campaigns, which were used to compromise mobile devices. So, I'm very, very confident that when the evidence is clear, and it's in our national security interest to do so, that we expose and take action against entities, whether they come from China or elsewhere. Of course, there are a range of threats posed by a range of actors, and we take the necessary actions to respond.
Okay, so you mentioned the December 2025 sanctions on the China-based cyber firms. Is the government considering designations for known Chinese-linked disinformation and influence networks more broadly?
So we haven't publicly attributed any information operations from China in the UK, but you'll be aware, and I'm sure the committee is aware of allegations elsewhere in the world. Particularly examples in Canada, in the Philippines, in Taiwan. Of examples that their authorities have referred to, and of course we take information threats, information warfare from wherever it comes very, very seriously, and we keep a range of options under review. I don't, as you know, comment on future possible designations, but I think our record shows that in a range of threats that we've seen emanating from Chinese individuals or entities, that we are not afraid to act where it is necessary to do so to protect our national security.
I totally note that. I just think there seems to be an apparent disparity between the actions taken against Russia and Iran when they've got linked FEMI campaigns and those linked to China. And I wanted to specifically share, the committee heard from witnesses who said that Chinese narratives on the Ukraine conflict appear to be coordinated with Russia. Is there any assessment being done by the Foreign Office on this?
Well, look, I'm deeply concerned by any reports of disinformation emanating from China, as I am from anywhere else. And we will continue to develop our capability to respond. And we take, obviously, a long-term and strategic approach to China, rooted in our national interest. And, China's obviously... huge opportunities as a trading partner and a cooperator on many other fields, but of course we also recognise real national security threats as well. And the Security Minister set that out very clearly when he responded in the Chamber on these issues in November. As I say, we've looked very carefully at the examples. I mean, you'd be aware of this example in Canada, the so-called spamiflage operations. Possible alleged electoral interference, reported by the Philippines National Security Council. Taiwanese authorities talking about a 60% increase in misinformation. So we're well aware of the types of activities, but as I said, we haven't publicly attributed any activities here in the UK. I don't know if Jonny wanted to add anything.
I only to add that we are clear that the challenge of information and manipulation and interference is not limited to Russia. This is a challenge that multiple states are now using the tactics and tools of. And while we have, over the last 12, 18 months, stepped up the scale and tempo of our activity against the acute threat from Russia, we are absolutely expanding both our own work, our partnerships, our engagement with our allies globally, beyond Europe, on actually looking at what this threat picture looks like beyond and what that means for future action.
Despite budget considerations. If I think what I'm going to do is, if it's all right with staff, I'm going to undertake to send for that piece of evidence that we heard about China amplifying Russian messages to the Minister, and perhaps if he's in a position to be able to comment, I think that would be good to have. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I just linked to all of that, just a question then perhaps for you, Minister, is which then for you is more of a priority, national security or the opportunities, economic opportunities that China presents?
Well, I mean, we don't take sort of either or decisions like that. We take strategic decisions based in the UK's national interest, and of course, our national interests range across a range of issues. But the Security Minister was very clear about the range of national security threats, and that we respond absolutely as appropriate to those. And there's a track record of examples, some of which I've illustrated to you.
Could I move on to talking about Iran? Mm-hmm. So from one significant country to another. Written evidence to this committee has said that alongside Russia and China, the Iranian regime plays a key role in spreading disinformation to advance its extremist ideology, nurture anti-Semitism and undermine democratic institutions in the West. Mm-hmm. What's the Foreign Office's assessment of that threat? And in particular, given the rise in anti-Semitic incidents across the UK, the role of these activities in fostering anti-Semitic sentiment and the threat to Jewish communities in the UK?
We're very, very clear about the risk from Iran, and you'll have seen in the National Security Strategy last year that we called out, and I will quote years of aggressive and destabilising activity by the Iranian regime, which has included activity specifically targeted against UK interests at home and overseas. And obviously, I would include the the matters that you reference within that, and we're very concerned about the threat that they pose both across the Middle East and beyond, seeking to exploit divisive issues, including in the UK. And of course, this ranges into a range of hybrid and other activities, and you'll have heard what the Director General of MI5 said in October last year, that they had tracked more than 20 potentially lethal Iranian-backed plots in the last year. So we are incredibly clear-eyed to the threats posed, whether that's in the information space or whether it's physically.
Given all of that, the Intelligence and Security Committee was critical of the government's response to Iranian threats and raised concerns about the level of internal expertise. I just wondered what the FCDO think in terms of whether they have the required expertise to ensure they can competently assess these Iranian threats, and if anything's being actively done to enhance that expertise.
We have excellent teams in our Iran unit, and I've worked with them very closely, along with Minister Faulkner, in on issues relating, for example, to Iranian sanctions. We sanctioned 36 individuals in relation to malign Iranian activity, and I'm very, very confident in the advice and the expertise that we receive on these issues.
Good. Edward.
Thank you, Chair. Turning to the United States, in the last year or so, the US has either closed down or defunded or redirected the activities of the Directorate of National Intelligence's Foreign Malign Influence Center, the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, USAID, which has supported anti-FEMI activities abroad, and of course closed the Global Engagement Centre. And I'm just wondering what the impact is in terms of UK-US cooperation on countering misinformation and disinformation.
Well, the first thing is, I would say again, the US remains our primary partner for the UK in defence and security, and a unique and special relationship that goes back decades, not least as NATO partners, but also in terms of our own extraordinary bilateral defence, security and intelligence cooperation. Ultimately, decisions for the United States about how they spend their money and how they organise their organisations is up to them. It's not for me to comment on. But we continue to coordinate very, very closely with the US on a range of shared national security threats.
I ask because earlier on in your evidence you said that you correctly identified willing fools in British politics echoing Russian talking points. Last November, Nina Jankovic, who was the head of the Disinformation Governance Board of the Department of Homeland Security, in evidence said, "We see a lot of pro-Russian disinformation making its way into the US political discourse, all the way up to the highest office in the land, the Oval Office." And I just wonder whether or not our interests in countering misinformation and disinformation still align with the United States under this administration.
I would go back to what I said, which is we're not talking about here individual comments, viewpoints, expressions on different matters. As I said, I very strongly believe in freedom of speech. This country does. We've got a proud record on it, and we're not talking about legitimate political discourse here or expression of different views, which I may or may not agree with on any particular topic. And we've got issues which we have differences of opinion with the United States on, and that doesn't shy away in any way from them being our closest defence, security, and intelligence partner. What we're talking about here, and what we as the FCDO are aimed at focusing on, is disrupting industrial scale information warfare by adversaries, which is something that's very, very different.
I disagree with your point about them being our closest ally historically. I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, how difficult or how much more difficult does it become for the FCDO to counter misinformation and disinformation when the President of the United States echoes Kremlin talking points that we are actively trying to counter elsewhere?
Well, look, I'd be very clear that the President Trump is engaged in extremely important efforts at the moment, alongside ourselves and European partners, and indeed President Zelensky, to try and find a peaceful and just and sustainable end to the war in Ukraine, and we're working very, very closely with him and his team on that issue, and that's what we're focused on. As I said, I'm just simply not going to get into commenting on any individual point or remark made by anybody in the US system or anywhere else. As I said, we are focused on industrial scale operations, exposing those, disrupting those, identifying, exposing the funding and the organisation that goes into them by Russia and other threat actors. That is the focus of our work.
Thank you, Chair. The Minister knows I like to talk a lot about sanctions, so I welcome the measures that His Majesty's Government has pursued over the last 12 to 18 months on disinformation designations in particular, RIBAR for instance. I did want to talk a little bit more about the United States, however. And just before Christmas, US Secretary of State Rubio announced visa restrictions on 5 individuals, which the Minister will know about, including 2 UK citizens for allegedly, and I quote here, being agents of the global censorship industrial complex who have led organised efforts to coerce American platforms to censor, demonetize and suppress American viewpoints they oppose. Those 2 UK citizens are the CEO of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate and the CEO of the Global Disinformation Index. What do you make of that development?
Well, you'll appreciate, Ms. Brickell, that there are ongoing processes around these individuals. I'm extremely limited in what I can say, but we're aware, obviously, that the United States has announced visa restrictions on 2 British citizens. We don't comment on individual cases. We continue to engage with the US on these issues through appropriate and established diplomatic channels.
Okay. On X, the US Undersecretary of State for...
Can I just ask, if those 2 individuals gave permission, waived that permission, and said that they didn't mind the Foreign Office commenting on what it was they were doing, would you then tell us?
No. Look, we just don't comment on individual cases in that way, and it wouldn't be appropriate. But we're obviously very aware of this case and engage in the appropriate way. But US visa policy is for the United States.
I appreciate that, Minister, and you said slightly earlier in your testimony that it's not for you to comment on US domestic affairs. However, on X, US Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sarah Rogers, has criticised the UK's Online Safety Act, the EU's Digital Services Act, and claimed that the sanctioned individuals mentioned had, and I quote, collaborated with US bureaucrats on speech suppression. Isn't it the case that free speech in the UK and across Europe is equally as vital as free speech in the US?
Well, look, we've made very clear, and I've made clear again to the committee today, that we're fully committed to upholding the right to free speech, and I think it's again one of the things that makes this country great. And we support laws and institutions which are working to keep the internet free from very harmful content, and we shouldn't be seeing social media platforms used to incite hatred and violence or spread fake information or videos for that purpose. I'm not going to get into commenting further on the individuals or the comments made about them.
I just want to bring this to life a little bit, because in light of the Heaton Park synagogue terrorist attack, the CCDH found that X failed to uphold its own policies on hateful conduct and violent speech, including 100 posts spreading false flag conspiracy theories, which got more than 568,000 views. Doesn't this speak to an uncomfortable truth for the US administration, that actually it's often US-owned social media platforms which are host to the systemic disinformation we see flooding our public discourse?
Look, I mean, I've spoken regularly in this place in the past, including when I was a member of the Home Affairs Committee on these issues, and exposed all sorts of different issues that I had serious concerns around. Again, I would get away from focusing on individual platforms, because the reality is, and particularly in terms of what we're looking at, is that any platform can be, they're just the mediums, and obviously if you've got specific concerns about X, to take those up with them and their policies. But I mean, I would just say that I'm proud of what we're doing with the Online Safety Act. It is going to increase our ability to deal with that very, very harmful and most disruptive and damaging content.
Only if it applies to children.
Well, there are a range of issues that we're looking at, and of course we're also looking at other matters in the Defending Democracy Task Force in terms of wider activities, and again building resilience to this industrial style activity that we're seeing coming from Russia and elsewhere. But I'm confident that colleagues in DCIT, DCMS and others have the appropriate relationships with social media companies and others to engage on these matters. But as I said, I would get away from the very specifics about individual platforms here, and we're focused as the FCDO on disrupting the origins and the industrial scale operations behind the information that's coming in here. I don't know if Jonny wanted to add anything particular to that.
The only thing I'd add is I wonder, Chair, if it would be helpful if DCIT provide further information to you on the Online Safety Act and then its relationship to the National Security Act and the Foreign Interference Offence, and essentially how it operates in this space, just as part of this inquiry.
Definitely.
Has any official within the UK government been denied a US visa due to their work on countering disinformation or online safety following the introduction of new visa restrictions? Are you able to say?
So could you say
has any government official been denied a visa in the US due to their work in this space?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Brickell.
Okay. And then I guess my final question is, you touched on in your testimony earlier, Minister, about individuals in this place and elsewhere in UK politics who propagate disinformation from other hostile actors, including hostile states. One of my areas of concern is the very small financial incentive that can often be used to propagate that. And we saw that with the high-profile case of Nathan Gill at the end of last year. Are you able to say more about the overlap between illicit financial flows and how some of this is used to support the spread of misinformation and disinformation to undermine our democracy, and that in other countries as well?
Well, I think we all saw those images of wadges of cash, that were found. It's a shocking case, and that is exactly why partway through December, the Secretary of State for Communities and Housing and Local Government and the Security Minister announced an inquiry into countering foreign financial influence and interference in UK politics, and that's being led by Philip Rycroft. I think it's going to conclude by March, and I await its findings and its recommendations with interest.
In light of the US national security strategy effectively advocating for the US to overtly support political parties in other countries that share the Trumpian worldview, I'm just wondering, the scope of that inquiry, will it also cover American influence on British political system?
I've said what the terms of the inquiry are, and obviously you're very, very welcome to write to Sir Philip about what he's looking at. He's obviously doing that on behalf of the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. The US national security strategy is a matter for the United States.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is striking, isn't it, for someone watching, that within the last 2 minutes we've discussed 3 different government departments, which does rather underline Uma's point about should this not be centrally coordinated.
So just going back on that point, we are closely coordinating together. I mean, I really do want to reassure you, Chair, of that and the committee of that. And, I sat with members of the Defending Democracy Task Force just a few weeks ago, and of course a range of other agencies that we have to work with very closely on these issues, including, of course, parliamentary authorities and the Electoral Commission and other bodies that have an important role here in upholding the integrity of our democracy and our systems. The truth is that, of course, this includes multiple departments because this is an issue that affects every part of UK national life and society, and I think if that was anything I wanted to sort of leave the committee with a clear understanding of, is that the attempts of our adversaries here are kind of a widespread and they're broad in their nature, and that's why it's important that we do work to look at all the different possible ways in which they're trying to influence our societies.
Do you have a follow-up question?
I do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, what's the reluctance, I suppose is the word, to have a central task force here, or not task force, a national centre?
There is a central task force. The Defending Democracy Task Force.
Sorry, but like the countering disinformation centre that I mentioned earlier. Why can't we have just one central agency?
I mean, look, we do work very closely with Jonny. Can speak a little bit more again to the level of coordination that goes on between officials, but ultimately, matters about structures of departments, agencies, and otherwise, usually for the cabinet office and others rather than ourselves. I mean, I'm here to speak about the work of the FCDO in these matters, but I can assure you that we are working on a daily and weekly basis with colleagues in the other departments.
We have a National Cyber Security Centre. I guess this is a comparable. Would the FCDO make representations to say you think it could be a centralised unit?
I think the comparison, for instance, with cyber is a really good one. And as we look at how we build out the architecture to deal with this threat, we do look at lessons from cyber. And for instance, within the Foreign Office, as a director and indeed ministerially, I'm also accountable for looking at cyber threat and the Foreign Office's activity to challenge cyber activity. And even therefore within our current cyber architecture, while we have an NCSC is not the single home for all of government's cyber activity. It has a specific role within government. The Foreign Office then delivers component parts as it relates to that and so on. So I think, as the Minister says, for an effective response to this FIMI challenge, we need pretty much every department playing a role in some various way. I think that's why we look at coherence and coordination as opposed to a single entity.
Yeah, look, I'll be completely honest. I mean, it's a really important challenge that you're making, and I welcome it. I'll look forward to what the committee recommends, and I'm sure across government colleagues will as well. But there is a challenge in that sometimes if you stick all things into one agency and stick it over there, people go, well, that's their business, they're dealing with this. The scale and the pervasiveness of this threat is so significant that we need every part of government, every part of society aware of, equipped, resilient to respond. And that's why it's important, as Jonny said, the coordination that goes on.
The challenge is, though, that there are so many different government departments, as you say. I mean, we've counted, I think, 4 that we've discussed, just this morning, who have a role in this. And I think one of the questions is, how many have you got? 5. You got 5?
I think it's 6.
Oh, 6. All right. Well, there we are. But it's also a question of accountability. Things go wrong. Who's going to be basically, if things go wrong in, the May elections, who's going to be held accountable on that? And that's why this is urgent and important, I think. That's not counting them.
We're up to 7.
You're up to 7.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that
please,
one?
Yeah.
So is there a minister in each of these departments whose job is identified, and do they all sit on the Defence Democracy Task Force? Where do they all come together, or is one meeting of all the ministers who are kind of like the people, the ambassadors within each department?
Yeah, we come together in that Defending Democracy Task Force, and it has the appropriate departments represented. Look, I'm happy to write with what information I can. I don't own the Defending Democracy Task Force, so I don't want to sort of give information about the way it operates just here today. But I'm very happy to write again with some further information about how it's structured and how often it meets. What I will say as well, of course, it's not just ministers, it's not just government departments, it's also relevant agencies that have important roles in defending our democratic institutions.
Is it each department plus others?
Plus others, yeah.
Okay. Alex?
I think we've covered most of the issues on defending democracy that I was going to ask about. So
I think also did you want to also ask some questions about online platforms, or
sure,
that's been covered as well?
So you've talked a bit about your work with DCIT in the Defending Democracy Task Force and otherwise. We saw lots of evidence of inauthentic content in the European neighbourhood. How, inside that mechanism or otherwise, are you putting that information, sharing those lessons learned with DCIT so that they can see the same type of behaviour that's happening in the UK?
Mostly, and this is a conversation I was having with my counterpart in DCIT just a few weeks ago. Jonny, want to add a little bit on that as well?
Only, as the Minister said, yes, and on an ongoing, persistent, continuous basis of an exchange of information. And as we look at the systems we've created, getting that flow right between what we identify in the Foreign Office, what we draw from partners, how that feeds into the domestic system, how we work with DCIT, and actually the action we take, the upstream links to the domestic. So yes.
We might identify inauthentic behaviour and coordinated behaviour, and then really the question is, in the UK, what can we do about it? You can speak to the online platforms and ask them very nicely if they'll do something about it, but there's nothing more that we can do, is there?
Well, there are a range of measures, and under the Online Safety Act, as you know, under the national security legislation as well, and a range of other measures that we're taking to reduce foreign interference. I would definitely recommend, Chair, as Jonny suggested, that perhaps inviting in colleagues from DCIT to, and the other domestic departments to discuss that and be very, very welcome.
One of the most effective ways of countering disinformation is through properly resourced professional media. Now, the UK was a founding partner of the Media Freedom Coalition and has a strong record of supporting independent media, but there is a perception that it is a less of a priority in the Foreign Office than it once was, and it's notable that we haven't received any report from the Foreign Office on the work on media freedom, which previously was given every 6 months. Can you say something about what the Foreign Office is doing to support media freedom, and if we can have a report, as was always the case before?
I can definitely come back to you with some information on that. I can assure you that work continues, because I've witnessed it, and I've been. I don't want to name individual countries, but I've seen some of the very important work that we're doing with a range of media organisations globally, and including in a number of European locations where some of the challenges that we've been discussing today are prevalent. So I'm very happy to try and get you some further information on that.
If you could, and I suggested to the previous Foreign Secretary that the UK could perhaps take back the chair of the coalition in conjunction with another country. He was quite interested in that, so I hope that is still something to be considered.
Take that away.
And just on a similar theme, possibly the greatest asset that we have propagating truth and countering disinformation is the BBC World Service. Mm-hmm. I raised that with the Foreign Secretary when she came before us just before Christmas. At that stage, she was not in a position to give us any information about future funding of the World Service. But if it is a priority, can you tell us yet whether the Foreign Office is able to say what the government will be doing to support the World Service?
And if you can't tell us when it is today, tell us when we're going to know, because we really want to know.
Well, Sir John, you and Chair, you will know of my love and admiration for the BBC World Service. I'm an avid listener, and it's one of my most trusted sources of information that I go to myself, and I love having it on in the car when I'm driving around the constituency and to and from London. I think it's a fantastic organisation and truly remarkable, and despite the difficult fiscal context, the funding obviously saw a significant uplift of 32.6 million. That's 31% to 137 million for this financial year. I think that demonstrates very assiduously our continued support for the World Service. The grant and aid funding is going to be decided through the FCDO allocations process, and the allocation decisions will be made imminently, in good time for the start of the 2026-27 financial year. And obviously you'll know the Charter Review is looking at imminently. I mean, in the new year, as in now.
We are in the new year.
We were told the autumn, but
no. Look, I'm very happy to try and come back to you with a more specific date, but it's a very live,
really want to know.
Very, very live process. But look, I think the decisions made in the last financial year give you an idea of the scale of importance we place on it. What I would say, though, and I just say this with all again, huge respect for what they do and that they must continue to do, and also particularly the language services and the other aspects of what they do is remarkable. But we do need to recognise that the global media landscape, as well as in the UK, is dramatically changing. And in terms of how information is then actually disseminated, how many people are actually listening on radio itself, how many people are listening linearly versus in clips or in on BBC Sounds or on other forms of information dissemination is dramatically changing. And I think we need to recognise that in terms of where people are getting trusted information sources, that has dramatically changed, including on all those platforms that we've discussed today. So I think in terms of combating the type of industrial information warfare that we're seeing from Russia and elsewhere, that has to be done through a range of mediums and a range of routes, drawing on, of course, the remarkable reporting and trusted work that they do. And I think we've just got to be clear about that. funding the World Service alone is not a solution to the types of problems we've been discussing today. It's one of the many important tools that we have, and they're of course an independent organisation, trusted. We don't control what they say or do. They stand on their own reputation, but it's only one of the many tools that we have. I wouldn't want us to think that that's just the sole response.
I'm the government's green paper on the future of the BBC, which I shall be debating in Westminster Hall in about 2 hours' time, has a specific section on the World Service in which it talks about considering the way forward for funding. Mm-hmm. And as you all know, the BBC are pressing very hard, but the Foreign Office should take back responsibility for funding the World Service. I mean, obviously, that would represent quite a significant increase in expenditure, but I mean, is that something that you're at least considering?
I'm not going to get ahead of the Charter Review and the different funding options that are being considered, but well aware of the different proposals that are out there.
Since we have we're just at 12 o'clock, I've got a number of bids in to just ask some quick fire questions. And with your indulgence, can I take a glass of water and let's see how we get on?
A glass of water.
Fleur, shall I go to you and then I'll go to Ed?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. Can I just ask a question which joins up a couple of your answers during this session, if I may, and it's coming back to funding. So the role of civil society in investigating disinformation, unearthing it, we've seen in the Western Balkans, but we know that's across the world, and countering that public information. And then you've twice mentioned ODA cuts and referred us to Baroness Chapman in the Western Balkans and in Africa. And those cuts might be to civil society organisations that might be then doing some of that. I mean, there's a big area. We've also mentioned US aid cuts, which are some of them we've heard in evidence are having an impact on those civil society organisations able to counter disinformation. Now, previously, the Home Office has spent FCDO budget on hotels in this country, so there is a precedent for spending from different budgets in the national interest as it's seen by the government. Would it be possible for defence money to be spent on that civil society work which is countering what is warfare? It's an expansion maybe of what the defence budget has been used for, but is that under consideration?
Yeah, I go back to what I said before about our journey towards the 5% target, and that is for security and defence writ large, and of course dealing with a range of threats and challenges that we face. I'd also point to the fact that we already again very closely coordinate with those departments through the Integrated Security Fund and other funding mechanisms, and I closely work again with those ministers, particularly the Security Minister and Minister of the Armed Forces, the MOD and others, about how we are jointly aligning our priorities and ensuring that we're collectively delivering more than if we just looked at these on a zero-sum departmental basis. So, I'm always engaged in those conversations and have been so in recent weeks.
Good.
Minister, given that you are responsible for both North America and Europe, and also uniquely have a perspective on overseas territories as our Minister, I thought you might be the perfect person to talk to us about Greenland. Mm-hmm. What is your view of the statements that have come out of the US administration on under whose influence Greenland lies?
You've heard very clearly what the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary said. Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary answered questions for I think nearly 2 hours, and made her views, and I was there for much of it. Made her views very, very clear on this. I've been repeatedly clear that Greenland's future is a matter for the people of Greenland, the Kingdom of Denmark, and we're absolutely crystal clear about that. And the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been too.
I'm just wondering if it raises any difficulties for the British government in terms of our cooperation with the US to have a NATO ally overtly threatening the sovereign territory of another NATO ally to which we are also aligned.
I've been very, very clear about our position on this, consistent on it over many years. Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been absolutely clear in the last 24 hours. I haven't got anything further to add to that.
Is Greenland or the Arctic discussed within government? I mean, is there...
Absolutely, and in fact, I've met with the Greenlandic Foreign Minister twice in the last year and a half. I regularly meet with Danish counterparts. I've been in touch with my Danish counterparts in the last 24 hours. I was in Denmark recently myself, and we one of the things we've done actually under this government is establish a new working group across ministers on the polar regions. I'm responsible for the Arctic and the Antarctic as well, amongst my many responsibilities. And one of the issues that we have looked at very closely is the range of UK interests and engagement with allies across. Traditionally, I think the focus would have been on solely on the science, the environment, and so on. But as both the Arctic and the Antarctic are becoming geopolitically contested, it's very important that we ensure that UK national security interests and those of our allies are met, and we continue to cooperate very closely, of course, including with the United States, and we do so.
Does that committee meet regularly?
It meets a number of times in a year, and of course officials meet in between that. Very happy to provide you with more information on that. We recently published a new strategy on the Antarctic, which is very, very important. The committee's welcome to have a look at. And I was actually recently on board the Royal Research Ship Sir David Attenborough, meeting with our fantastic scientists and teams from the British Antarctic Survey. But of course, in the opposite time of the year, the last year and this year, I believe they will be spending around Greenland actually doing important scientific work. So we're absolutely committed. I was the first minister in 10 years to go to the Arctic Circle Assembly, government minister to go in the last 10 years, engage regularly with colleagues. Been up in Tromsø with our Norwegian friends, looking at Russian and other attempts to destabilise the High North, and this is a matter of regular contact I have with our Nordic and Baltic partners in particular.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to the topic of sanctions, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina. Because the Democracy for Sale Substack reported at the end of last year that Charles Crawford, the UK's ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina in the mid-90s, and Sir Dominic Chilcott, former UK ambassador to Ireland, are both registered as lobbyists for Republika Srpska on the FIRS scheme. Were you aware of that, Minister?
I think I'm aware of that, yes.
What do you make of what appears to be two former British diplomats lobbying on behalf of Milorad Dodik's regime?
I'm not going to comment on individuals or their activities. That's a matter for them to answer. What people do outside of government, provided it's in line with the requirements under the appropriate regulations that apply to former officials and ministers, is for them. I'm not going to comment on that.
Well, thank you. I don't think anybody else has got any other follow-up questions. So, thank you so much for your forbearance and answering the questions as fully as you have. This concludes this particular session. Order.